The anime begins with our protagonist, Vanille Fertile, who is reincarnated in another world after dying from overwork. Now, in this new world, he finds himself in the body of a 2-year-old child and possesses the memories of the previous owner of the body. When he meets his maid, she is surprised to see that he can speak fluently. Ivan mentions the names of his family members, which leaves the maid even more shocked. At one point, however, he asks where they are located. Sometime later, while everyone is eating, we meet the rest of his family, the third son, Sesto, the middle child, and Arda, the eldest, along with Mercia, and the head of the family and Marquis, Jalpa. The atmosphere at the table is quite tense, except for little Van, who is very rude to the servants. His father asks what tasks each one has for the day, and his children, a bit nervous, share their duties. When it is Van's turn, he responds that, in fact, he doesn't know, as there are many things to do, but he is interested in learning about the culture and history of that nation. His siblings are surprised to hear him, while the father bursts into laughter. He is impressed to see that, at just 2 years old, Van is someone extraordinary, and makes it clear that with him, the future of the family is secure. The Marquis also expresses anticipation for Van's magical aptitude test when he turns 8, as he expects great things from him. It is then explained that in that world, there is magical aptitude, something essential that the nobility must master. The elemental attacks of earth, water, wind, and fire are fundamental to protect the people. Those who possess aptitude for other elements are considered a disgrace. Van's father and brothers have aptitude for the 4 elements. Sometime later, Van begins to ask the maid about things in that world and discovers that there are other races, such as elves and dwarves. Furthermore, there are also magical minerals capable of storing energy, just like my power, meaning this is magic. However, they are interrupted by the house butler, who asks Van if he still remembers the things he has learned. Van replies that sometimes he forgets some characters, but who still remembers well what he studied so far. Espada tests him by asking what 3 plus 2 is. Van gets a little nervous, as that frightening butler intimidates him, but he answers correctly. Espada then says that from now on, he will be responsible for his tutoring, and thus begins the infernal lessons. Van is bombarded with studies, but thanks to this, he quickly learns to read and write in just a week. Of course, he learns to read and write in that world, meaning a completely different writing system. Thus, 2 years pass under Espada's tutelage, and now, at 4 years old, his fencing lessons begin. A maid named Tio ends up humiliating him beautifully, and he, embarrassed, goes after her. However, the other maids stop her and warn Tio that she is risking her own life by mocking the young master, as mocking a noble is a serious crime. They ask Van to punish her, while Tio nervously squeezes her buttocks. However, Van only gives her a light tap on the head as a reprimand. The other maids say that this is not enough, but Van replies that it's enough for him. Thus, a year passes practicing fencing, and upon turning 5, he can already fight on equal terms with older military children, proving to be much superior. After all, they are just children, and their attacks are quite predictable. The most surprising thing for everyone, however, is how Van manages to relate to common people, unlike his brothers who look down on everyone. While resting, the sub-commander approaches and asks to see his hands. Upon observing them, he is surprised that there are no calluses, as he imagined Van trained until nightfall. Van then explains that studying too much leaves him exhausted. Dai reveals that, according to rumors, Espada wants him to study 3 times more than others. Van cannot believe it, yet Dai warns him that if he wants to learn more about fencing, he can talk to Espada, as that old man is very stubborn. Dee believes the young lord should dedicate himself to the art of the sword, and he would personally take charge of making him the best swordsman in the kingdom. Van replies that he likes both things, so he will continue to strive. But he says he will personally train him and assures that he won't push him too hard since he is still a child. However, Van knows perfectly well that this is a lie. When the personalized lessons begin, he discovers that Dai is another demon who trains him all day long and, during breaks, commands him to stay in a guard position to rest and train at the same time. This guy is not just a demon, he's also an idiot. Uncle takes it upon himself to comfort him while Van thinks that, although the days are exhausting, the truth is that he has fun every day since he was reincarnated. The damn Dai starts dancing while Van thinks that he will live and enjoy this new life to the fullest. Thus, another year passed, and now, at 6 years old, everyone starts calling him a prodigy. However, so many fencing lessons and studies are practically wearing him out. So, he decides to sneak out to the market with Tila since he plans to become a bum. At the market, he asks about a large infrastructure, and Uncle explains that it is the Great Mari Company, a huge trading enterprise with branches throughout the kingdom. However, the moment is interrupted by a man dragging a tied-up child. Upon noticing that they are watching, he asks what the hell they want. The soldiers take a guard position because he has disrespected the young lord, but Van stops them and asks why he is taking the boy tied up. The man replies that he can do whatever he wants with his own son, and that he is taking him to sell him as a slave. Uncle explains that poor families sell their children as slaves when they cannot support them in order to survive. At this moment, a young brunette with reddish hair is surprised to recognize Van as the son of the Marquis. He wonders how she found out, but understands everything when Uncle shows the cloak. The girl introduces herself as Rosalie and invites them to enter the company to buy anything they desire. The man from before panics upon discovering that Van belongs to the Marquis's family. Van then asks Rosalie how much she would give that guy for the boy as a slave. She observes him and asks the boy's father about his magical aptitude. The man replies that his son has a knack for theft, which means he isn't worth even 3 hefty silver coins. Furious, the man lunges at the boy, saying that he is practically worthless. Rosalie asks what the hell he is doing with his own son, but the man tells her not to interfere. At that moment, Van intervenes and offers to buy the boy for 5 hefty silver coins. The uncle hands over the money, and the man leaves immediately. Van approaches the boy, introduces himself, and frees him. When he asks the boy's name. The boy says his name is Kumsim. Van tells him that he is now free and can go wherever he wants. However, noticing that Kumsim has nowhere to go, he asks if he would like to come with him to the mansion. One of the guards warns that he seriously doubts the Marquis would allow him in unless he were brought as a slave. Van laments the situation and asks Kumsim if he would accept to follow him in that capacity. Kumsim replies that he would. Before buying clothes for him, Rosalie handles the slavery contract. The mark appears on Kumsim's hand, and Rosalie explains that it will remain as long as the contract is active. She also informs Van that, since this is his first visit, she will let this go for free. Van thanks her, and Rosalie, surprised that a noble expressed gratitude, runs off. Over time, Kumsim begins to live peacefully in the mansion, working for Van. At one point, he mentions that the sub-commander D is looking for him. Van gives him a cookie as a bribe to keep quiet about his whereabouts, but Kumsim replies that he should already know. Van asks about his gloves, and Kumsim says he doesn't mind showing the bond with his master. However, upon learning that Van bought them especially for him, he puts them on immediately. Hearing that D is coming, he quickly leaves the room, saying that Van is not there. Even so, D notices the crumbs on Kumsim's face and realizes that Van bribed him. After some discussion, D decides to take Kumsim to train him in Van's place. Van apologizes to Kumsim, and thus the years continue to pass. When Van finally turns 8, the moment of the magical aptitude exam arrives. The entire kingdom is anxious for the result, but on the day of the exam, everything turns dark. Upon discovering that Van has no aptitude for any magical element, he has only an aptitude for production magic, considered the most pathetic of all, since it serves only to create swords or jewelry, things that can already be made without magic. With such weak magic, he wouldn't be able to protect the people. His father declares that he is a disappointment, and that it was a mistake to place so many hopes in him. The Marquis holds the sword, and Van panics, wondering what the hell he should do. At the last moment, however, his brother intervenes. The father asks what he thinks he's doing, and Mercia replies that on the border of the Marquisate, there is a village that, due to its location, has never been able to develop. Mercia suggests that it would be best to send Van there. The village has only about 100 inhabitants and lacks special products. To the north, there are mountains rich in resources, but inhabited by large magical beasts. Furthermore, the region borders the county of Ferdinand, and on the other side, the enemy kingdom, with Elenita serving only for occasional military exercises. The father understands that this is a newly annexed territory, whose loyalty is still fragile, and that sending someone from the family could yield good results. Thus, he informs Van that he entrusts him with the lordship of that village, and that he must leave as soon as he is ready. He then congratulates Mercia for finding a good use for that useless one. When the father and the other brothers leave, Mercia apologizes to Van, saying that he couldn't bear to see him suffer, and that's why he made such an absurd proposal. Van replies that, thanks to him, he didn't die. Mercia tells him not to worry, and that even if it isn't much, he will do everything in his power to help him. And the next day, Aunt is furious because, even though her little lord has no aptitude for magic, he remains someone very wise and admirable to her. It is a terrible injustice that he is exiled to a remote village. Van responds that she doesn't need to worry, for in fact, he is excited. This way, he will have more free time and can still shape that village as he wants, living a peaceful and happy life. He watches the loading of his luggage and realizes that they didn't give him an official escort. However, his brother Mukria hired 10 adventurers to protect him during the journey. Van feels very grateful to Mukria at this moment. Tila rushes to him and warns that she is his personal maid and intends to go along. And it's not just her. Dee also decides to accompany him to continue teaching him the art of the sword. Although Van would prefer him to stay, he is surprised because, theoretically, they shouldn't have assigned knights to accompany him. However, Dee doesn't mind at all and tells Arte and Louis to get ready. And it doesn't stop there. Espada also decides to join him, saying that he has decided decided to expedite his retirement since his successor is ready, and he prefers to spend his old age supervising Van's education. Van can't believe it. Thus, he sets off on his journey, thinking that everything would be quite quiet since his father didn't want anyone to know that he had been exiled. However, along the way, a girl asks why he is leaving. Van asks how she found out, and she points to the grand farewell they are having. Arte explains that these are the orders of Sub-Commander D, as he thought it was a shame for Van to leave the city so discreetly, and that the least they could do was give him a dignified farewell. Van remembers that his father ordered nothing to be revealed, but Arte replies that the problem is that Lord D ended up falling asleep, and, when he wakes up, they will tell him to take down the banners. However, Van sees the damned Dai shouting his farewell, loudly, while Argo, embarrassed, strategically leaves. Thus, Van leaves the kingdom in the best way possible, surrounded by the affection of all the citizens. On the way to Van's territory, he picks up a branch and transforms it into a small sword, shocking the others. Kanchim asks if that is production magic. Van confirms, saying that he wanted to test it a little and hopes it will be useful for something. At this moment, they arrive at the village. Van comments that if Kanchim gets tired of life there's no problem going back to the Marquis's house, as the slavery contract can be cancelled. He also says that he will ask his brother Mukria to take care of him. Kanchim immediately refuses, stating that he will not leave and that he will always be by Van's side to protect him. Suddenly, the carriage stops. Van, worried, asking what is happening, Arby replies that the village is being attacked. Everyone disembarks from the carriage and begins a meeting to decide what to do. Dai believes the enemies are either a gang of bandits or a group of former mercenaries, as they appear to have combat experience. Van notices that, despite the village being surrounded, the arrows fly calmly over the fence. In front of the gates, there are tough men, roughly 50 in number, and he asks Van for permission to enter the battle, saying that if they work together, they might be able to win. An adventurer immediately objects, claiming they are too few in number. Dai admits it will be dangerous, and that there will likely be casualties, but believes they can confront the enemies. Again, the adventurer opposes, stating he was hired only to escort Van to the village and not to enter a war where his group could be killed. He asks if he could at least protect Van if things go out of control, as the knights will attack alone. The adventurer agrees, but Espada goes against this idea, saying that if D dies, the future of the village will be precarious. Espada comments that he is a mage of the 4 elements and explains his plan. First, he will build a barrier, and the adventurers must attack from a distance behind it. When the enemy focuses on them, Dai and his men will attack from the side. Van asks if Espada really intends to fight, which the butler confirms, saying that if he does not continue the attack behind the barrier, the criminals will manage to kill Dai and the knights. Van says that in that way, Espada will end up dying, but the old man responds that it is an honor to serve at the end of his life. Still, Van knows that if Espada and D die there, he will have no chance of developing the territory, not to mention that his father, the Marquis, will probably kill him. Then Van asserts that it will be his role to serve as bait. He despairs and immediately refuses. Kanchim says he will take Van's place, but he refuses and declares that he will assume that role, as he receives intensive training from the captain of the knights every day and will not die easily. Even if that happens, it is the lord of the land's duty to die for his people. Furthermore, since he will not reveal his name, this will not cause problems for the Marquise's family. We then see a flashback in which Orto, the leader of the group of adventurers, complains about having to escort a rich noble, saying that there is no decent person among the nobles, as they all discriminate against commoners and adventurers. His companions ask why he accepted the mission, and he replies that he planned to stay in the ugly Marquise's territory for a while, and had no choice but to accept. At that moment, Van appears, greets the adventurers, and thanks them for accepting the escort. As he leaves, he thanks them again, making Orto comment that, in rare cases, a decent noble appears. Returning to the present, Orto steps forward and says they have left their lives in Van's hands, which confuses him. The adventurer explains that a child is risking his life, and if he does nothing, his companions will be furious with him. Pluriel comments that he has always mocked the determination of nobles, as they only know how to talk. But Van is different, and therefore they will trust him. Passing by Van, D says that they are the knights serving the Marquise's house, and that by protecting Van, they are protecting the future of the Marquise family's lineage. Espada comments that he cannot accept such an irresponsible tactic, and says that after everything calms down, Van will need to deeply understand the weight of the responsibility of being a candidate for future Marquis. He then modifies the plan. He will create a barrier and attack from a distance, while Dai and his men will go left, and the adventurers will go right. Espada quickly creates a barrier of earth, leaving Orto impressed with the speed, as he didn't imagine he was a mage of that caliber. One One of his companions comments that if Espada didn't agree to fight alongside the young master, he would do so in his place. Orto thinks that if Van becomes the next leader of the family, it would be a very good thing, as he is a decent noble. The bandits continue shooting arrows, commenting that it will be easy until one of them is hit by an arrow from behind. They realize that the attack is coming from behind a wall that wasn't there when they arrived. The leader orders them to attack the people behind the wall. But as they advance, he says that he appears from the left, decimating the enemies, while Orto comes from the right, doing the same. The attack becomes increasingly intense, and the bandits realize they are being cornered. The adventurers and knights continue to eliminate the enemies until Dai shows up with a threatening aura and says that those who wish to die may step forward. The bandits panic and start to flee. The leader quickly moves behind the walls to defeat the mages, and Orto asks someone to stop him. Pluriel gets scared upon seeing the enemy, but when he tries to attack her, Van appears, dodging the attack and injuring him from behind. Kanchim advances and delivers the final blow. Van then orders everyone to stay alert, leaving Pluriel shocked, wondering what kind of child he really is. Upon finishing, he mentions that they managed to reduce the enemy without suffering any casualties, achieving the best possible outcome. Now, all that's left is to collect the payment to complete the job. At that moment, the purple elf Pluriel asks if something is wrong with him. He simply replies that he feels a bit curious, and everyone imagines this is due to the boy Van. He confirms this and makes a proposal. Although they don't earn much money, he thinks about staying in that place. This leaves everyone pondering. Then, one of them apologizes, saying he already has another contract to fulfill. He says not to worry and hopes they can meet again in the future. Thus, they bid farewell to the rest of the adventurers, although Pluriel decides to stay too, saying that Van saved her life and she needs to repay the favor. The others who stayed comment on how incredible it is that he is only 10 years old, and everyone agrees, also saying that he is the only noble they really like. Everyone is eager to see what kind of domain the boy will build, and then decides to help him for a bit longer. Just at that moment, the uncle appears scolding Van for putting himself in danger, and our protagonist apologizes. Shortly after, Dai also arrives, exclaiming that the victory was formidable and congratulates him on the job. Espada approaches, warning that the villagers have gathered at the entrance. Van thanks them and, as he approaches the gate, mentions that it's time for his presentation. Upon entering, they realize the village is large, but they also notice how everyone is very frail and extremely thin due to hunger. Here, we meet Honda, the chief of the village, who thanks them for saving him once again. Van is confused and asks if this has happened before. Honda confirms and explains that the reason is that they used to belong to Count Ferdinand, and the knights patrolled the area. However, this stopped happening once they came under the Marquis Fertile. Aware of this, Van apologizes on behalf of his father. He explains that he was not yet aware of the situation of the smaller villages. In light of this, Honda asks if that means that since they pay little taxes, it's not worth protecting them. Van says that complaining solves nothing, which irritates one of the villagers, but he clarifies that he is talking about the future of the village. While the nobles have great responsibilities, the real problem lies with the laws imposed by the Belle Rene royal family. However, they cannot change the kingdom's laws, at least not for now, so they have to seek solutions. Van proposes 3 concrete measures. The first is to give the village a value that the kingdom cannot ignore. The second is to earn money and hire mercenaries. And the third is to remodel and develop the village. A woman intervenes, saying they have already thought about this, but it's not easy at all. Van reassures her, saying that now they have him as their new lord. Obviously, the reaction is not the best. Then, to support Van, Espada introduces himself as the former head butler of the Marquise's household and claims that Van is a genius. Dai also introduces himself as the sub-commander of the Knights of Fertile. This cheers up Chief Honda, who asks the protagonist if that means he has mastery over the 4 elements. Ivan clarifies that he has the aptitude only for production magic. This causes their hopeful expressions to change to deep sadness, as this magic is considered the worst of all. And of course, this also discourages our little protagonist. Then, a villager asks about the taxes, as before they charge 30% of the harvests. Van responds that he will reduce it to 10% for a while. This relieves all the villagers. With that resolved, Van suggests starting to reinforce the walls and asks the sword if its earth magic lasts over time. The sword replies that it remains strong as long as it is active with its user. Once the user is done, it transforms back into a mound of earth. This is enough for Van, so he asks them to raise walls as a temporary measure. Everyone is surprised to see a wall being erected in a matter of seconds. Then, Van asks them to also make an effort to fend off invaders. The knights offer to take care of that task, and even say they will prepare traps and pits. Van thinks this is fantastic, and turning to the villagers, says that their cooperation will be essential for the village to be reborn stronger than ever. After that, our protagonist says he wanted to test his production magic a bit. He takes a piece of a log and concentrates. He makes heat slowly rise from the pit of his stomach, sending it to the tips of his fingers and visualizing each fiber of the wood, weaving them like a rope. He knows that the thinner they are, the more he can obtain a block of wood. The uncle asks what he just produced. Van replies that it is a block of fiber, something similar to nanofiber, a term they are unfamiliar with, so they make strange expressions. After a while, someone walks by and sees all the blocks that Van created. He picks one up and comments that it is very light but extremely hard and asks if he can cut it. Van allows it, but when he tries to cut it, the person can only strike it and send it flying away. The cube remains intact but ends up damaging a tree. Everyone is surprised by this, especially since the blow was strong enough to split a rock. This means Van achieved what he wanted. A few hours later, we see that Van has created even more cubes and even weapons. They ask if his mana has not run out yet, but he says he has not felt that depletion yet. He comments that production magic consumes so much mana that it is usually difficult to create even a single object. That's why it is considered useless. Out of pure curiosity, he creates a katana and notices that Kamshin is fascinated, and he decides to gift him. Then, he realizes that the uncle also seems to be expecting something, and, as a clever man of few words, he ends up gifting a woman an axe. Yes, quite clever given the strange expression she makes. Van wonders if she doesn't like axes. The uncle pretends, saying it's a magnificent axe since she was delighted to see it. Van is happy that she liked it, but upon closer observation, thinks that next time he will make a prettier accessory for her. At night, he goes to rest and comments that his whole body aches from having slept outdoors throughout the journey, in addition to feeling dirty for not being able to take a bath. He knows that the uncle and Kumsim are pretending to be fine, but they are surely as tired as he is. Therefore, before reinforcing the defenses, he decides to ensure the basic needs are met. Thus, he makes the decision to build a house. The next day, everyone wakes up. The villagers see the cubes and ask what they are. Then, Van asks if they would mind him building a house in that area. The old man replies that lately the squares are hardly used, so he thinks the spot is ideal and perfect for his lord's mansion. Van thanks him and thinks to himself that once everything is more settled, he will organize festivals and carnivals. He then focuses on building the house, envisioning all the necessary parts, from the pillars and stakes in the ground to the walls and the roof. He then releases his magic and creates a mansion in a matter of seconds. This feat leaves everyone completely amazed by the house that has just been built. Everyone praises him and is left speechless. Van is glad that his production magic is useful for everyone, although he sincerely thinks the size of the house got a bit out of hand. Kumsim comments that Van's magic is much better for a landlord than the magic of the four elements. Van says that his magic is even interesting, but elemental magics are much better for protecting the people of the Bao territory, as people living in an area protected by elemental magic feel safer. The uncle and Kumsim immediately disagree, commenting that they would rather live in Van City than in Jalpa. He doesn't quite believe them, for they are very biased. Sword says that Van is right, for in times of war he would not be able to protect his people. However, the people want a lord who can improve their lives, and in that regard, there is no one better than Van. Even Dai agrees, commenting that he never imagined Van could even build a house. The leader of the adventurers, Orto, states that Van's power far exceeds that of a common production magic. Van mentions that if they bring wood, he will build a house for them. This leaves both shocked, and they call their subordinates to gather wood, as they cannot miss this opportunity. The village chief asks Van if he could also build a house for the villagers, as the houses are in a deplorable state. Some comment that the rain enters their houses and that some don't even have floors. Our protagonist thinks that doing everything at once will be tiring, but reflects that the village really needs a drastic renovation. He then tells the villagers that he will build houses for everyone and thinks that if his production magic can make everyone happy, then that is what he will do. He starts renovating the houses. Uncle explains that the houses were previously deteriorated and it was difficult to live in them, but now they are as good as new. Dai is shocked not only by the amount of magical power Van possesses, but also by the knowledge he has to build mansions and houses like those. Van explains that it is a grid design, basically 4 houses grouped with wide streets arranged in a grid pattern. The houses for the village families were designed to be uniform, so there would be no differences between them. He says that for now it is good, but when they have better quality stones, he will renovate everything. The villagers are extremely grateful and give him some things. Later he builds a simple bathhouse next to his mansion, and all the women of the village are happy to hear about it. He constructed the bathtub and asked Pluriel to fill it with water magic, while he asked Kansim to heat the water with firewood, naming the place Bath. Goemon asks Van to take off his clothes and bathe with them, but he immediately refuses, saying that he is old enough to bathe alone. He says he never imagined that he and the villagers would be treated with such luxury. The maid comments that Van is that kind of person. The mage says she is really surprised, as he is a rare noble and an incredible child. This triggers Van's fan mode, so she starts talking non-stop about how Van has been amazing since he was a baby, and how he earned the title of child prodigy. At night, Van is relaxing in the bath and comments that, yes, he gained muscles, but he still looks very skinny, compared to Dai. Van remarks that anyone looks skinny next to Dai. At that moment, Dee arrives with all the knights to take a bath. Van tries to escape, but Dai holds him back, saying that they will train in the bath. After that, Van goes to his room and sleeps after a tiring day. The next day, the knights create a moat. Ivan imagines that if they fill it with water, it would be great for the city's defense, as well as providing drinking water and water for bathing. Immediately, they start working to take water from the river and bring it to the village. Espada, with his earth magic, drills dozens of meters at once, while the others dig by hand. Dai looks like a tractor. Meanwhile, Van strengthens the ground and the walls and is shocked by Dai's energy. Espada comments that he is already 40 years old and still full of energy. Uncle thinks that the distance from the river to the village is quite large, so it will take a lot of work, but since they cannot live without water, it's the only way. Van thinks that if the environment and living conditions there improve, it will attract traders, which will be necessary for living there in the future. However, since this work will take at least a week, there's no point in thinking about it now. Even so, in the afternoon they can already see the village. Ivan is shocked, thinking it was ridiculously fast. Ending the day there, Dai doesn't understand why, as if they keep going like this, they would reach the village in just a few hours. However, the assistants are already at their limit, struggling just to remain standing. Dee and Espada comment that they wanted to continue, but since the team can't go on anymore, it's fine to stop there. Van is shocked to see that the two still have energy to continue, thinking they are both monsters. The next day, everything is ready. Van thanks everyone for their cooperation, saying that they certainly went through tough times in the last day and a half. But thanks to this, they can now have water in the village. He gives the order to the sword, who removes the stone that was blocking the way. Water starts to gush out and everyone is amazed. Shortly after, the whole effort is filled with water. Van comments that if it rains, the water level could rise and flood the village, and he asks the sword if it would be better to build a lake. The butler confirms, saying they can use the lake as a reservoir for a future drought. So, they build a lake behind the village. The uncle is amazed, as a village that didn't even have a stream of water now has a lake that serves as a reservoir. The village chief thanks Van because, thanks to him, they no longer need to go to the river to fetch water. Van is happy to be able to change the lives of people. That night, on a road, inside a carriage, a little girl named Alte wakes up and Panamera asks if she is okay, stroking her hair. Alte says she is fine and thanks Panamera for being so nice to her. The two play inside the carriage, and then Panamera asks her to rest, as there is still a long way to go before they reach the border village. The next day, Van focuses on the defense of the village, creating a wall. He explains that he combined earth and stone in the wall to make it as sturdy as concrete. Zara says that with such a wall, they will be safe, even if thieves appear. Van wants to make the place even safer, and creates several simple ballistas to reinforce the defense of the territory. He places shields in front to block enemy attacks, while still being able to shoot arrows. The uncle tells Van that his production magic can create practically anything, and that although the village is small, it looks like a fortified city. The sword comments that it no longer looks like a village, but rather a small fortress. Dee says that simple thieves would not be able to conquer the place, no matter how hard they tried, and adds that if Japa had noticed Van's power, the Marquis family would significantly grow with him as a lord or even as an assistant. The sword asks him not to speak that way, as the head of the family always placed greater importance only on the ability to fight. The knight tells the butler that just by observing him, you can already understand what Van is capable of, asserting that he has the ability to fight because he possesses more power than anyone else. Espada disagrees again, saying that Van's power is geared towards protection and is not suitable for attacking other countries. Dai responds that war is not just about soldiers facing each other. Van interrupts the discussion, saying that lamenting the circumstances does no good, and that they should do their best with what they have available, which shocks both of them, who agree, asserting that even if the territory is pushed to its limits, they can still come back stronger in the future. However, Espada interrupts him, asking him not to advise Van to go against the Marquis. At that moment, Van's stomach growls, interrupting the conversation. He eats and finds Uncle's food very good. She is relieved, as there were not many ingredients to prepare the meal. The butler comments that defense is important, but they need to find a stable source of income, since the only way to buy things there is through a vendor who appears only once a month. Van says he can take care of the construction of the houses and furniture for now, and that they can manage with the food from the village's crops. However, upon hearing the butler mention that they don't have ingredients to make Van's beloved sweets, he panics and asks for ideas on items they could sell. Campson suggests selling wooden blocks made by Van, but the idea is dismissed since only he can produce them. Uncle suggests hunting monsters and selling their materials, but that idea is also rejected since only adventurers can hunt monsters, and they need to think of something that truly comes from the village. This is how we now see them in the forest. Zara says she can't stand the fact that, apparently, Uncle and Campson love the gifts they received so much that they both refuse to get them dirty. Van gets annoyed, but the two justify themselves, saying that it is a family treasure. Realizing Realizing this, Van thanks them for valuing their gifts so much, but reminds them that they need to use them to be able to defend themselves. At that moment, Zara takes out a shield that is supposedly quite durable. Van asks Kamshin to try hitting it hard, even feeling a bit bad about it, seeing how weak the hit was. Zara asks him to do it again, but this time seriously. As she says this, she hears something fall to the ground. Turning around, she sees a piece of the broken shield lying on the floor. Realizing this, she starts to cry, saying that she hadn't even used the shield for the first time yet. Van reassures her, uses his magic, and mends the shield. Zara is surprised to see that it is now as good as new. Suddenly, Ordo asks for a moment with our protagonist. Approaching the minerals, he asks if they could buy all of it. He mentions that in that forest, at the foot of the Wolfbrook Mountains, there are many dangerous magical beasts, and that might be why they managed to extract rare minerals without needing to climb the mountain. Then, he shows that they have iron, copper, silver, gold, and even mithril. He questions why no one had extracted these minerals before. Then he clarifies that what he is about to say is just a supposition, but he believes it might be due to the distance and the area being hard to access, causing knights only to come and explore. Van understands that if they found these minerals here, the entire mountain range must be filled with resources. He asks if he can use the iron ore and receives permission. Thus, we see Van use his magic and transform it into a cube, explaining that, although he has melted it, he has not removed all the impurities, so he doesn't know how pure it is. The chubby guy in the group is impressed. He asks Van if he could create some swords. Our little protagonist agrees without hesitation, and Zara asks for a short sword and a long one. Immediately, Van begins his work, focusing on the thickness, and after a few seconds, he compresses the material to the maximum, thus creating a short sword. Then, Van prepares to create the long sword, following the same procedure, and after a few seconds, he finishes it. Seeing the finish of the blade and the hilt, Zara screams with excitement, and the others also ask the protagonist to make swords for them. Van feels nervous but agrees. Pluriel examines the sword and comments that it could be easily sold for a good price. Van is surprised by this. At that moment, they approach the mithril, highlighting how strange it is to have found it in the forest, as this might mean there is a dungeon nearby. They explain how important this would be, since if there were a dungeon, the village would be filled with people and goods. They add that dungeons are sources of national treasures, such as jewels and relics, which, by protocol, when a new dungeon is reported, the guild establishes a headquarters in the nearest village. Van is uncertain whether it is a good idea to inform them now, as he still doesn't have what is necessary to accommodate the guild's personnel. Furthermore, the neighboring country might invade them to seize the treasure. Floriel, confused, asks if they wouldn't send soldiers to protect them and confirm the existence of the dungeon. Orto confesses that he is merely a nuisance to the fertile family, and that, if they realize that place has value, they would quickly expel him and send him away. In light of this, Pluriel suggests discovering the dungeon only after he has already made the village prosper. That way, it would be much harder for the Fertiles to interfere. After discussing this, Van orders his men to avoid the dungeon area while collecting resources. Seeing that they do this for him, Van expresses his deep gratitude. Returning to the village, Van and Uncle were walking through the streets when suddenly a villager comes running, shouting that a stampede of armored lizards is on the way. Immediately, Van orders to raise the drawbridge and close the gate. The villagers obey, terror-stricken behind the wall to prevent the creatures from crossing the Sao moat. Assuming the role of leader, Van stands firm and says he understands their fear and that they don't want to fight. That's precisely why everyone will fight together, because he knows he cannot protect them alone. He asserts that he needs everyone's help, and with great determination asks them to join forces to protect that village, which is also their home. But anyway, if you've made it this far and want the next part, comment the word dungeon to show that you reached the end. The villagers are motivated by Van's speech and vow to fight to their last breath to protect the village. Van tells them to go immediately to the wall and take their positions behind the balliste. Kanchim informs that Orto and his group have gone out to hunt. Then someone needs to take charge of the situation. Ivan decides to go up with the rest of the citizens. However, his uncle grabs his arm, tears in his eyes. Ivan may not be a simp, but he doesn't want to hurt her either. He asks Dai to climb up to the wall and report the situation to him in real time, while Van stays on the ground giving orders. Dai accepts the mission and runs to the top of the wall, and the scene before him leaves him stunned. He warns Van that about 40 armored lizards are approaching, each approximately 8 meters tall, equivalent to 3 elephants stacked on top of each other. Free units of measurement, he begins to panic upon seeing this, as even a group of veteran knights struggles to take down a single armored lizard, and now they only have a handful of trained fighters. Van orders that they load iron arrows onto the giant crossbows, and Dai immediately moves ahead to carry out the order. The knights comment that normal weapons don't work against the armored lizard's tough scales. and Dai knows this. He says that so far he has won every battle he fought, but this time he will trust his instinct and let Van take command. He tells everyone to load the ballistae, and then orders them to fire. The arrows disappear as soon as they hit the lizards, and it takes a moment for Dai to realize there are huge holes exactly where the projectile struck. The hit armored lizards fall to the ground a few seconds later, still propelled by the inertia of their own bodies. Soon, in the first volley, the villagers bring down 10 of them. Dai is impressed by the quality of the weapons made by Van, and also by the villagers, who for some reason are able to aim better than my teammates in ranked matches. He tells everyone to prepare for the second round, and the knights warn that there is only one iron arrow left for each ballista. Dai tells them to load and shoot anyway, and they manage to take down a few more armored lizards. However, half of the enemies, are still standing and the ammunition has run out. G relays the situation to Van, who starts to think of a solution. Suddenly, he remembers. The wooden sword of Kantim managed to cut through the high-spec shield of the Fate, so just imagine that this might also work against the armored lizards, and tell Guy to use wooden arrows. The knights think this is pure stupidity, as wood shouldn't penetrate the skin of the lizards, tough as steel. Dai tells everyone to shut up, saying that Van has proven them wrong many times before, and this time he will trust what Van says. He orders the villagers to load the wooden arrows and shoot, and to everyone's surprise, even the wooden arrows manage to pierce the lizards, although they get stuck halfway through. Fortunately, that is already enough to hit their vital organs and kill them instantly. At that moment, Dai realizes that nobody can defeat them. He tells the villagers to load and shoot again, saying that tonight they will feast on lizard meat. The villagers obey and rain arrows down on the armored lizards, exterminating what remains of them. Dai proudly declares victory to Van, and the villagers start celebrating loudly. Uncle hugs Van tightly as he still tries to process the fact that his wooden weapons actually worked against such powerful monsters. At the top of the wall, the knights comment that no one on their side was injured, and that there's still plenty of ammo left. Dee thinks the battle ended too quickly and feels a bit disappointed, but it just shows how broken Van's ability is. Shortly after, the villagers begin processing the bodies of the lizards under the guidance of Ordo's group, which returned quite late. Ordo tells them to preserve the eyes, fangs, skin, and magical core for sale. As for the meat, it should be stored for consumption. He explains that usually processing armored lizards takes a lot of time, and that much of the meat rots before it can be used. But thanks to the knives made by Van, the work becomes very easy. At that moment, Van arrives, inspects the mountain of meat, and decides to organize a big feast to celebrate the victory. At night, the festivities begin, and people eat as much meat as they want. Orto's group talks with Van, and he says that the weapons he made work extremely well. He hears this and asks Van if he has ever made weapons for adventurers before him. Orto's group starts displaying their swords. Dai feels jealous when he sees this and asks Van to make a sword for him, saying he is willing to write a blank check. The other knights also want weapons made by Van, and he shyly replies that he cannot accept their money, but that he is a bit busy at the moment. He promises to craft new equipment as soon as the village's matters are settled, and the knights are satisfied with that. Then, Orto tells Van that usually an armored lizard sells for 20 gold coins, but since most of the meat will rot, they end up with about 8 gold coins per lizard. Even so, it's a lot of money. Ivan is overwhelmed thinking about how he will use all of this. Then, Espada brings terrible news, saying that when a village earns more than 100 gold coins, it has to pay half to the Marquis as tax. Van feels as if he has lost all his life savings in a cryptocurrency scam. Hearing this, he asks if there is any way to commit tax evasion. Espada tells him that there's no way to hide the sale of such a large quantity of materials, and Van loses all hope. Still, what worries him most is the fact that his father might discover the importance of that village, because if that happens, he will be exiled to some distant place. Suddenly, Espada has an idea and says that they can bypass the situation by reporting everything to Muria instead of Jalpa. Van realizes that they can credit the defeat of the lizards to his older brother, which would cover their actions and allow them to stay in that village longer. The next day, 2 merchants arrive at the village and are completely flabbergasted to see the enormous wall resembling a fortress in front of them. They start blaming each other for reading Google Maps wrong and getting lost on the way. Suddenly, Van appears atop the gate and welcomes them to his village. The merchants are shocked to recognize him as the genius son of the Marquis and wonder why he is in such a remote place. They introduce themselves as Bell and Rango from the Merry Chamber of Commerce. Ivan allows them in as soon as the merchant brothers arrive at the warehouse. Their mouths drop open at the sight of the materials collected from the armored lizards. They find it hard to believe that such a small village could have hunted all those monsters, but Van only wants to know if they can buy all of it. The merchants immediately respond that they can and ask Van to wait a month, as they need to organize a whole team to assess and transport everything. Van agrees and asks them to take some meat for free, since it's going to rot anyway, as he still can't create a refrigerator. Then he asks the brothers to take a look at some weapons that are also for sale, and they are amazed by the quality. They accept Van's asking price without even trying to negotiate, and he asks them to promote them. The brothers hesitate to respond, and Van realizes that these newbies think they are professionals capable of monopolizing the trade of their swords. He tells them that even if they try to keep everything a secret, people will eventually discover the village, as they can trace the route they use. The brothers are shocked to hear this. Even says there's another way for them to make absurd profits. They are eager to know what it is, and he suggests that they open a shop within the village. The brothers immediately accept the proposal and bow to Van in gratitude. He then says that they should build the shop immediately, even before fully understanding what he meant. Van creates the shop they have always dreamed of and says he hopes to do great business with them. Shortly after, Van receives two guests he didn't expect at all. One is a young noblewoman, almost the same age as him, and the other is a tough knight with a warrior mom aura protecting her. The knight arrives full of judgments and declares that she will find out if Van is truly a genius or a fraud. Meanwhile, Van is receiving a homework assignment about swordsmanship that tells him to plan a city capable of housing 10,000 people, because at the rate the village is developing, it will soon become a city. The sword asks what kind of fortress city Van desires, noting that square-shaped fortresses are the most common. However, Van struggles to be discreet and states that he wants to build a star-shaped fortress, as this would force attackers to waste a lot of time dealing with the defensive points scattered around the fortress. The sword likes the idea and begins to help him with the design. At that moment, the red-haired knight bursts into the room, announcing that an emissary from the neighboring county of Ferdinando has come to see him. Van allows them to enter and discovers that it is indeed the young noble and the knight. "Hello, ladies," he greets them, and the knight introduces herself as Panamera, who became a viscountess after rising from the rank of knight. The girl nervously introduces herself as Arte, the youngest daughter of Count Fernando IV. Van invites them both to sit down. Panamera immediately asks why Van thinks they are there, and he replies that they came to assess him and try to win him over should he seem like a threat. Panamera bursts out laughing upon hearing this, as Van hit the nail on the head, and then explains that Count Ferdinando believes that Marquis Halpa sent his genius son to govern that village as part of a plan to conquer his territory. However, Panamera thinks that Van was sent there because he lacks elemental magic. Van decides to be honest and says that she is right about the lack of elemental magic, but he is not there to lead any war. He was simply exiled by his father. Panamera refuses to believe this. After seeing how much Van has developed the village in such a short time, she begins to believe that about 5,000 soldiers were sent with him to turn the village into a military base. Van bursts out laughing upon hearing this and then apologizes, explaining that he was expelled from his family with only his luggage and his calmness, and that no one even came to say goodbye to him. Panamera then asks if she is hallucinating at seeing the butler and the vice commander of the knights there. Dai replies that he came on his own to complete Van's training, and that he ignored the messages from the commander of the knights asking him to return to the capital. The sword also mentions that it has retired and is now teaching. Van has a hobby, besides asserting that he wants to serve Van forever, as he treats everyone with kindness, regardless of social class. Still, this does not explain the accelerated development of the village. So, Van decides to give a demonstration to the guests, as it would be quicker. He takes them outside the village and asks Espada to create an earthen wall so that he can transform it into a fortification-level wall. Panamera is impressed by the old butler's magic, but she says that the wall will crumble as soon as it loses its structure. Immediately, Van uses his magic to turn the mud wall into solid concrete and then uses wooden nanocubes to create a gate. Panamera and Arte are completely stunned to see this and ask what Van's magical attribute is. He replies that he can use production magic, considered the worst type of magic, and that was exactly why he was exiled to that place. Hearing this, Arte remembers her own unhappy life, and then Panamera decides to move on to her second objective. She tells Van that she was sent there to offer Arte's hand in marriage, and he understands that the Count wants to hand over his daughter to ensure that Van does not try to conquer his territory. Van responds that a marriage is unnecessary, as he does not want to conflict with anyone, and is only developing the village because he wishes to live a peaceful life in that place. Panamera says that at first, she wanted to prevent Arte from being promised to the lord of a nameless, small village, as she believed that she would not find happiness in such a precarious place. However, after seeing Van's potential and character, she starts to support the marriage. Panamera begins to praise his intelligence, charisma, and the willpower to turn difficulties into challenges, even going so far as to say that if it were legal, she herself would like to marry him. Van gets excited about the idea of having a mommy waifu, but unfortunately, for now, he can only be with Arte. Panamera then turns to Arte and asks if she wants to marry Van, sincerely stating that she cannot imagine a better man than him. Arte becomes shy and replies that Van is a good person, but has not yet thought about marriage. Van also tells her to take as much time as she needs. because this is the most important decision of her life, Panamera. So she says they will spend the night in the village to think it over. Van is shocked to learn that they will be staying there, but when Panamera asks if he has a spare room in any mansion, Van decides to build an inn specially for them. After that, they have dinner together, and Van decides to get to know better the girl who might become his future waifu. Arte shares that she likes cute things like flowers and dolls, and Van asks if he can see the dolls she has. Arte is happy that someone is interested in her and eagerly agrees to show the dolls that are in her carriage. Later, Van accompanies the two to the inn. Panamera leaves the two young people alone so that Arte can tell Van that he is a good person before running off to her own room, embarrassed. Van then returns to his mansion, where Espada comments that since the Count sent his own daughter to marry the lord of a nameless village, it is quite likely that she is also not an elemental mage. He finally realizes that Arte has also been exiled from home and decides he will let her live in the village, should she want to, even if they do not get engaged. The next day, Tio and Kenchim wake Van up in a panic, saying it is an emergency. Even Dee and Espada have raced to the site. Van is quite confused as he has just woken up, and Tio explains to him that days ago, he created the village lake, which was named Lake Van. On the way to the lake, Van asks why. The lake bears his name. Tio explains that the villagers were happy about the creation of the lake and named it so that future generations would never forget who created it. Kenchim adds that the villagers also want to name the place Village Van, but Van asks them not to do that. Upon arriving at the lake, Dai comes to meet him. Van asks what is happening, and Dai shows him a kind of mermaid in the lake. Espada explains that it is an apkaruru, a semi-human half-fish. They live in a beautiful river in the forest, but for some reason they still do not understand. They are here in the lake that Van created. Despite being an uncommon species, they are rarely seen by humans. Ivan tries to communicate with her, but he can't help but think that maybe she doesn't understand the human language. He asks his uncle to bring some meat. When offering the food, it works. She starts to approach, and when she gets close, she asks if she can eat the meat. Van confirms, and upon biting into it, she finds it very good and asks what it is. Van says it's armored lizard meat, and that, if she wants to come back to eat, he can offer her dried meat from then on. She asks who defeated the armored lizard, and everyone in the village starts to say it was Van. At that moment, she swims back to the water, and Van wonders if she will return again. The sword says it is a rare kind and that it shouldn't appear for a long time, but he was wrong because the next day not only did she appear, but her entire clan did. Kenchim wonders if this has anything to do with the defeat of the armored lizards. Van asks the sword if the armored lizards are some kind of gods to the Apkarurus because he is afraid they might seek revenge. The butler says he has never heard of anything like that. The leader then tells Van that he would like to speak with him. Van thinks the leader's eyes are frightening. The leader thanks Van for helping his daughter and says he heard that he defeated the armored lizards. Van confirms, and the entire clan is shocked that a child managed such a feat. When Van begins to explain that he did not do it alone, the leader of the Apkarurus suddenly says he accepts Van's marriage to his daughter, Lada, Priora, which frightens our protagonist. Vesta asks if he is dissatisfied, as Priora is his only daughter, who in the future will become a beautiful adult woman who will shine like a jewel. Van thinks she is still a child who does not understand something like marriage very well, and asks if there is any reason to talk about this. The leader explains that the clan has lived to this day without any contact with humans, but in recent years, the armored lizards began to invade the place where they lived, and many in their species did not survive. For this reason, they are looking for a strong husband for Priora, as they want to ensure a place where they can live in peace. Ivan understands that he wants strong allies, and that for this reason, he is offering his daughter's hand in marriage. He explains that in that case, she does not need to marry him, that she can grow up and choose who they want to marry in the future, and that even without marriage, he is willing to protect them. He sees this question. Will he really do that? And can they live there? Van confirms, saying he will start building immediately and creates 2 houses by the river for them. Vesta is shocked by his magic, and Van explains that it is a resting area and they can feel free to use it. Uncle and Cantum add that it is very spacious, so it will be relaxing for them, and that even on days of heavy rain, nothing will happen, as it is quite sturdy. Sometime later, all the Apkarurus are relaxing at the site. Espada tells Van that it's time to deal with the sewage. He sees this question. What will he do? Van explains that he installed several sewage pipes under the constructions of the village and that the well water is periodically dumped into the facilities for sewage treatment. Vesta understands and says they will help, as they are good at underwater work. Soon after, we see Kantim opening the facility door with the help of the Apkarurus. Ivan thanks them for their help, and the leader asks if he does this work every day. Admitting that he does, the leader comments that he would like to take care of the sewage treatment as a way of gratitude for letting them live there. At this moment, Panamera and Alt arrive at the site. Seeing the Apkarurus, Panamera is shocked, as it is very rare to see them. At that moment, Vesta calls Van's son-in-law and thanks him for his generous hospitality. Alt is shocked by the word son-in-law, and Panamera asks what that means. When Van tries to deny it, Priora introduces herself as Van's wife and bids farewell, calling him husband, leaving him in hot water. Later, we see Van and Alt in a boat. He apologizes for the morning incident, and she says it's all right, that she loves the fresh air there because it gives a good feeling, and that Panamera has already explained the misunderstanding to her. Alt says that he created a lake and developed the village so much, and that is incredible. Van replies that this is thanks to everyone who works hard. At that moment, Priora appears calling Van husband. She asks who the girl with him is, and Alt introduces herself. Several Apkaruru children appear and start rocking the boat, making Alta fall with her hands in vain, which infuriates Priora. She approaches them and asks if everything is all right with her husband. Ivan explains that he spoke with her father and that they are not married. Priora then dives into the lake and leaves. The children start rocking the boat even more as punishment for hurting Priora. When they leave the lake, Vista approaches Van and says that she has told him everything. Then, this man imposes himself quite a bit, telling Van that he already has his daughter, and on top of that, is still flirting with another. Alta is taken aback, thinking he is talking about her, and Van tries to explain again. But out of nowhere, the beast says that they will have a duel. He wants Van to face his clan. If they win, he will formally accept the marriage with his daughter, which is obviously a big hassle for Van. The worst part is that suddenly, Dia appears saying that they accept the challenge. According to Dia, everything is in their hands, and he will ensure victory. Espada also agrees to the duel because if this is resolved quickly, he can finally focus on his studies. For Panamera, this is also interesting, although Van feels it is dangerous, as if they lose, he will have to marry. Still, his people are very determined, so the beast says that the decision will be best of 3. The first trial is up to Van, who has a pretty interesting idea. It's basically a game of volleyball but in the water. To allow them to participate, Van Nee creates bikinis for Panamera and the others, who are very happy with the outfits. She wants to participate and actually wants to win because she knows Van would have to marry Alta. Thus, the game begins. Panamera teams up with Uncle, while the Beast teams up with his daughter. The game starts, but they lose very quickly. Priora and the Beast are too agile and strong for this kind of game. They start to really thrash poor Uncle's team, and everything begins to get quite complicated. Uncle even starts to cry because the situation overwhelms him. Then, they decide to fight again. Very motivated, they start to move better until they finally score their first point. They continue fiercely until they tie, and then the decisive point arrives. Panamera tries to block the attack, but even so, they end up losing. The uncle starts to cry again, but according to Panamera, this is just the beginning of their legend. Even though they lost, the next challenge will be chosen by Besta, and he begins to explain it. The challenge will basically be a swimming duel, a relay race in pairs. Clearly, they have the advantage, which worries Van, as this way he will end up having to marry Priora. But Dai says there's no problem, and that he'll handle it. Cam Shin is also confident he can manage, so they become the candidates for this challenge. With that decided, Cam Shin faces Priora. She moves too quickly, and Cam Shin can barely catch up to her, but very stubbornly, he starts to push himself and ends up getting close. Priora then enters the water and swims even faster, reaching the exchange point. A few seconds later, Kenshim also arrives and shoots off like a bullet. Van wonders why he swims in butterfly style, and his friends explain that's how he trains. The good thing is that it works really well, because he moves super fast and ends up winning the race. But then a problem arises. While Dai was celebrating, she didn't notice that her bikini had fallen down. Besta never thought they would lose in swimming, but there is still one last challenge, and he decides to give this final test to his son-in-law. Thinking hard about his strategy, he comes up with a strange idea. He creates a snow cone machine, and they will use magic to produce the ice. He finishes the snow cone, adds various flavors, and it turns out very pretty, but Panamera asks what it will be used for. According to our protagonist, this is the competition, a duel of slushies. It will be a pair competition, and he will also participate. Therefore, Alt decides to support him, although the others have their doubts. In fact, already in the middle of the competition, she is also unsure of what she can do, but she decides to believe in herself and starts the challenge. They eat as fast as they can, but their brains begin to freeze. Still, Besta needs to keep going for his daughter, so he continues to push through. Van was honestly almost ready to give up, but looking to the side and seeing how hard Alt is trying, decide not to be left behind. He gathers strength from wherever he can and starts eating a lot. They eat and eat and eat without stopping until the contest ends. The winning duo was our protagonist and Alt, which means the victory belongs to Van. Being very noble, Besta approaches to congratulate him. Van feels happy, thinking that the engagement issue is resolved, but Besta says he likes his son-in-law even more now. He is definitely the ideal man for his daughter, and after that, he just bids farewell, saying he entrusts his daughter to him. In the end, winning meant nothing because Pryor is also very happy with her future husband. At that moment, our protagonist's stomach begins to hurt from having eaten too much ice, but at least least everyone is very happy because they had a lot of fun with this contest. Alta notices this. All the people around Van laugh a lot, and she wishes she could be like that too, but doesn't know how to achieve it. Since she was born, her father had always been so busy that he barely saw her. Her mother left her with a nanny and also didn't seem to care for her. The reason was simple. They considered her a failure. She was timid, sensitive, and didn't do well in her studies. She also had no special talents. The only thing she possessed was puppet magic. When she manipulated them, it was as if she could move them with more freedom than her own body. She thought that with this, she could make her mother happy, but she ended up being considered a disgrace to the family. It was then that she discovered that, among nobles, puppet magic is viewed as something evil and detestable. From then on, everyone stopped talking to her to the point that she felt invisible. When she was 10 years old, her father ordered her to marry a certain man. On that day, she was insecure and very scared, but the young Ben turned out to be very kind. His aptitude was not the magic of the 4 elements, but rather production magic, which was also considered inferior. Nonetheless, he exudes confidence and talent and uses his cards positively. For that reason, she believes that if she hadn't stopped practicing magic back then, it could have changed her life. Still, now she decides to try much harder. After a while, Van wants to continue developing the village and go back to working on the wall. He tells the villagers to work carefully and not to get hurt. Everyone feels very motivated, especially because the next day they will have a day off and today there will be a big barbecue. Panamera finds it curious to see how much he motivates them. Van apologizes for being so informal, but that's just how he is. It is then that Alt appears. She starts the conversation, wishes him good morning, and tries to strike up a chat. Van immediately notices that she seems more cheerful than usual. According to her, she feels full of energy, and inside, she thinks that, little by little, she wants to see the same landscape that Mr. Van sees. She wants to get closer to him. Therefore, she asks if she can watch how they work, and of course, he sees no problem with that. However, taking a quick look at the adventurers, it seems there is no time to relax. The star-shaped defense of Van's territory is ready, high, and is impressed with the structure. Van comments that, thanks to everyone who helped, they managed to complete the walls in 2 weeks. Panamera is shocked by the speed with which everything was built, and says that it never stops surprising her. Van thinks that her walls are also incredible, but thinks it's best not to comment. He says that, as the number of residents increases, he will also build more houses. She comments that she is a little jealous of him, as it is her dream to get a territory. But that next time, Battle will perform military feats that cannot be measured by money, and will requisition a territory. She asks what the object on top of the walls is. Our protagonist explains that they are ballistas. He modified the simple ballistas he had created before, and Panamera is shocked to hear that he was the one who created it. He explains the changes he made. The first one only fired one once, but this one fires twice in a row, one above and one below. He asks Kanchim to go up there and show how it works. Kanchim goes to the place and fires the ballista. The shot comes out with a lot strength, and when it hits the ground, it creates an immense impact. Panamera is impressed with the strength of the ballista. Van says he made another 100 units of it. She asks him to sell one of these ballistae for the whatever price you want, but Van, looking silly, says that they are not for sale. Panamera notices his insight and asks if he can give her a ballista, owing Van a favor in return. Accepts and says that at some point he will call in the favor. He asks if she has a vehicle to transport and what she is going to do about the arrows, as they seem to be quite heavy. Panamera says that he will get a carriage, and as for the arrows, as they are made of iron, he will ask a blacksmith to make them. At that moment, Kanchim interrupts, saying that it would be a good idea for her to have at least 2 Van's arrows. She asks why Kanchim then pulls out his katana. Panamera says she has never seen a weapon in that shape, but that she would feel insecure against opponents equipped with armor and shield. Kanchim asks if she had any swords that wouldn't be a problem to break. Panamera takes out his spare sword. The boy gets into position and attacks at an insane speed. Panamera thinks he didn't feel the impact and wonders if it was just a scratch. But at that moment, the sword breaks in half. Uncle comments that it is very sharp, and Kanchim says that it was something made by Van, so it is impeccable. The Viscountess asks what material the sword is made of, and our protagonist says that it is just iron. That's when Panamera realizes that the arrows can be made the same way, and Van confirms, saying that they can pass through 2 or 3 armored lizards, leaving her completely in shock. She asks if he can give her the arrows too, and thanks Kanchim for telling her about it, as now she can get powerful arrows. It is then that we see Orto's group shouting for them to run, and a dragon appears. Orto says they will attract the dragon and buy time, asking them to run to the village, but Van knows that he and the entire group would be in immense danger, and thinks about what he can do. Panamera says she will help him, as it is only a matter of time before the dragon attacks the village too. He asks Orto to lure the dragon close to the ballistae. The blonde explains that it is a dragon from forest of intermediate size, and therefore does not launch fire breaths. Van asks Alter to go to a safe place, and the others to go to the top of the wall with her. He says that the dragon is a formidable enemy, but even so, they will not lose, as they have. Reinforced ballistae Panamera asks Tio to stay with Alter, and orders them to call Sword Orto's group continues running. Ivan thinks that flying opponents are problematic, as they can simply fly to the village. He orders them to load the ballistae and aim at the dragon's wing to take away its ability to fly. At that moment, a member of the group trips and falls to the ground. Orto tries to get the dragon's attention, but it doesn't work. Then, Kara throws a dagger at his eye and manages to get the creature's attention. He says to don't worry about him and run to the wall, and Orto accepts, which makes Kara desperate. The leader says that he is the fastest of the group and will definitely be able to survive. Van orders the ballistas fire before Kara becomes a snack, but the dragon easily dodges the shots. Van wonders what they will do now. It is then that Panamera appears at the top of the wall, saying that she is going to make the dragon stop. Ivan thinks that he always imagined her to be a top magician, because while still young, a count gave her a position important, title earned through feats in battle. She begins to gather fire in her hands and throws a fire dart, hitting the dragon squarely. Ivan is impressed by her strength, but Kanchim realizes that the dragon is still alive. Our protagonist sees that this dragon is on a Kai, totally different level. He continues advancing towards the village, and Ivan asks for the ballistae fire once more. The dragon dodges most of the attacks, but its wing is damaged. Ivan orders them to fire again, but the dragon dodges all the attacks. Ordo and his group finally. They manage to get to the gate and are safe. Ivan is grateful that everyone is safe, but thinks they can't stay there for long and thinks it's better to retreat to the village. Panamera says he will buy time and throw another fire dart. The dragon dodges, but she controls the magic and hits it squarely again, making him fall once again. Ivan realizes that she is at a completely different level. Different. She goes to Ivan and says that she will retreat first and prepare to intercept the dragon. Ivan responds that he will be right behind her and asks everyone to retreat. However, at that moment, the dragon moves away, gets up and manages to climb to the top of the wall. Seeing that, Ivan wonders how much longer that beast will be able to resist. At that moment, Espada appears walking elegantly towards the dragon. Ivan shouts for him to back off, but Espada doesn't listen, as he doesn't intend to leave either. He reassures him, promising that he will buy time and then simply withdraw, face to face with the fierce dragon. Immediately, Espada builds a wall of earth and causes rubble to fall that crushes the beast. After that, he retreats next to Ivan, walking with extreme elegance, which worries. Ivan Espada justifies himself, saying that running is bad for his bones, so he doesn't do it. In light of this, Kanch tells Ivan that he will take care of Espada and asks him to go ahead and organize Ivan's defense. Agrees and runs towards the entrance, but at the same time, he thinks about the state of everyone. If they continue like this, it will only be a matter of time before the group is exhausted. At that moment, Panamera warns from the top of the wall that the defense line is already prepared. Upon hearing this, Van asks if can demand the favor from before. The blonde smiles and accepts without any problems, asking what he wants. Van then asks her to immobilize the dragon when he is reaching the wall, so that, next to the group of ballistas, can attack him with everything. Panamera recognizes that it is a good plan. Van apologizes and promises that when they defeat the beast, he will give him a lot of dragon meat. Amidst laughter, Panamera accepts. The dragon rises again, and Panamera, eager for the meat, prepares its explosion of flames. Van organizes the ballistae and orders them, even in fear, not to fire until they have him in their sights. They need more time, and that's when Dai and his team arrive, apologizing for the delay. Ivan asks if just the three of them will fight, and Dai replies that there's no problem as he has his weapons. Dai attacks with all his might, strength, but the dragon blocks, counter-attacks with another claw, and his men protect him. However, the creature's strength is such that it throws the three away. The dragon advances, but Sword covers them with another wall of earth. Vane then orders them to retreat and warns Panamera that the dragon is already close enough. She charges her flame blast again. Dai and her men run to get away from the blast and keep your distance with the dragon immobilized. Come order them to fire all the ballistae. Everyone hold their breath while the dust dissipates, not knowing if the dragon has died, and with great courage, approaches to check. When he sees that the dragon opens his eyes, he quickly cuts off his head, decapitating him once and for all. Van sighs in relief, and announces victory. Everyone celebrates, and the girls arrive asking if he is okay. He confirms Panamera also approaches, saying that Ruth is unharmed and praises Van for his leadership, congratulating him on defeating the dragon. Van responds who narrowly won, but recognizes that many villages would have fallen in less time. Panamera highlights that they have great heroes like Espada, who decapitated the dragon with a single blow, in addition to the incredible ballistae that managed to pierce the creature's scales. Still, Van wishes to improve them so that they can fire at least 10 arrows at once. Panamera then suggests holding a victory ceremony, stating that the man who most distinguished himself deserves the title of Dragon Slayer, and that they will announce the feat to the people, honoring those who made it possible. The leader of the KM family, Viscountess Panamera Carla KM, gives a speech. She comments that the forest dragon normally drags all the villages in its path, causing great damage to the fortresses, but that village survived without any casualties. Thus he names the heroes. First, Dai, who decapitated the dragon with a single blow. Second, Espada, the wizard who immobilized him. And finally, the fourth son of the Fertile family, Bangni Fertile, who, despite his young age, led and used magic never seen before to reinforce the village in such a short time, also taking command in battle. Everyone celebrates and applauds enthusiastically. In his thoughts, Panamera reflects who has met all kinds of people, but never someone like Bangshi. Then remembers her own story. She was born in the capital, into a traditional family of knights. When her magic awakened, she was quickly sent to a county that offered the best conditions. There, she trained so intensely that she preferred death, spending sleepless nights to become captain. Then she returned to the capital, had his achievements recognized, and became commander of the county's knights at the age of 16. He recorded many battles, accumulated military merits, became a nobleman, and, 6 years later, received the title of Viscountess. During her days as a nobleman, one morning, Count Ferdinand called her to say that he wanted to marry his youngest daughter to the lord of a remote land. It was then that he met the little Harut. At first, she questioned the count's decision, asking if it wouldn't be better to introduce her to someone without a title. The count replied that it depended on the situation, but that, if something happened, only she would have to deal with a boy. Thus, Panamera understood the situation, approached Harut, and promised that if the boy had no talent, she herself would reject the commitment. The little girl, without understanding much, asked if they were kicking her out of the house. Panamera reassured her, explaining that all her brothers were already committed and that it was common. Caressing his head, she wished that her fiancé was a good boy, confessing in thought that she felt empathy, as she had also felt nervous when being taken away from her own parents. Present, in front of the villagers after the victory against the dragon, Panamera recognizes the great man that Van is, takes a step forward, and promises to establish an alliance with the village. Van is surprised, but knows that this will bring many benefits. When she asks if he will accept the proposal, Van recognizes that for an ordinary person, and for the village's current situation, it is a unique opportunity. Accept without hesitation. And well, later in his office, Van talks to Espada about the defeat of the forest dragon. The butler says that it was worth raising the walls, because without that, the situation would have gotten complicated. States that it's just a suggestion, but now that the strong wall has been finished, they should focus on building the city. Van remembers that Espada once said that they should create a city for 10,000 people. The butler confirms and says that, to do this, they need to build an attractive city, and it is necessary to increase the number of residents. At that moment, Uncle enters saying that Belle and Rango from Compania Mercantile arrived and informed them that they are going to buy the materials from the forest dragon. Van is excited about the idea of selling the materials, as this way he will be able to build a city bigger. He goes to the brothers and asks why people from the mercantile company want to buy these materials. Rango replies that he is a large dragon and, moreover, a forest dragon. To the scales, claws, fangs, and eyes are in excellent condition and must be worth at least 100 platinum coins. Van thinks that a platinum coin is worth 100 million yen, and that if they are 100 coins, that will give 10 billion yen. He feels like he just won the lottery. We then see the two merchants talking, saying that they thought everything was a lie. At that moment, Van approaches of them, and the one in green says to leave everything in the hands of Compania Mercantile, Mary, as they will buy all the materials. The one in blue adds that they are the largest mercantile company in the country. They have the support of royal family and will pay the highest amount possible. Van asks how much they intend to pay, and the one in green responds that 60 platinum coins. Our protagonist partially turns around and says he needs talk to Belle and Rango. The merchants are desperate, saying that the brothers are still inexperienced as traders and don't know the correct value. Van comments to the brothers that apparently the dragon is not worth much, since they offered 60 coins. The two are incredulous, as it is clear that it is top quality material. The boss goes to them, saying that they are also part of the company, then they should say the same thing as others. However, Belle states that they are traders and must make a fair assessment. However, the chief says that in this remote village, even if they offer 60 coins, the boy will be forced to accept, or they will be expelled from the company. Still, the brothers refuse, saying that they want to do an honest business, regardless of the location or who they are dealing with, as this will bring them profit in the future. The two leave the warehouse, saying that the brothers will regret it. Van asks if everything is really okay, as they could end up being expelled. He asks why they don't create their own enterprise. This surprises them both, as it is not something that easy to do. They explain that they need to fulfill 3 conditions to create a commercial company. The first is to pay the membership fees to the Merchants Guild, the second is to have a physical store, and the third is to have the recommendation of someone who has a title of nobility. Van thinks that the first 2 are not a problem, but getting the help of a noble can be complicated. Soon after, we see Panamera saying that she doesn't mind offering the recommendation. Van, shocked, asks if she really accepts, as the company Mercantile Mary seems to be the darling of the royal family, and this could bring persecution for her. Panamera asks him to think calmly. As a rising nobleman, by approving the creation of a small commercial company, it does not pose any threat. The truth is that if they rush, it will harm the prestige of the royal family itself. Van thinks it makes sense to complete Panamera, saying that it does not have territory nor order of knights. Therefore, to aim for a higher position, it is important to perform feats that the people comment on. We'll probably talk about how she helped 2 traitors. Honest Ivan asks if it wouldn't be better to spread the word that it was she who defeated the dragon, so that her family doesn't find out that it was him. Panamera explains that a victory over a dragon is something grandiose. Even if she claims to have been responsible, they will question her about all the details and end up getting to him. Anyway, he wonders what to do so that his parents don't find out. Panamera says there is a solution. He needs to earn a title of nobility. She herself rose from a low position in the knightly order. But as he is the son of a marquis, he will probably get the title of baron first. Just disclose that he was the one who defeated the dragon, and that, in fact, she just contained him. Van is left desperate. As this will attract a lot of attention, Panamera does not understand his dissatisfaction. At just 8 years old, he has already earned the nickname Dragon Slayer and will receive a title of nobility for this feat. Still, she understands her feelings. When she won her first title, her enemies increased. There were even those who tried to take advantage of her, but she turned them all into ashes. Advises that, if anyone messes with it, do not hesitate to fire the ballista. When he accumulates 10 corpses, no one will dare face him anymore. Van is scared to hear such advice. He comments who, if she takes all the credit, could jeopardize Panamera's chances of lighting up even more. She asks if he's worried about her, as he doesn't think she's living a life that justifies the concern of a child of just 8 years. Van realizes that, in fact, he was worried about himself. Panamera tells him that he can rest assured for the next 5 years. Van, however, thinks that he will die in 5 years. He goes to the brothers, who are shocked to discover that Panamera will give the recommendation and happy to be able to open the store, getting straight to the point and asking Van to sell the dragon materials for them. Van agrees, and Bell says he will pay 130 platinum coins. Vanna thanks him and closes the deal. They decide to go to the royal capital to sell the materials, but find out that there are no carriages available to transport the goods, as the merchants from the Mary Company left with all of them. Panamera realizes that they want to harm the brothers, hoping that they come back crying for help. If they are unable to transport the materials, they will have to obey them. However, Vanna states that she will make new carts for them. Panamera also says that they can use their horses who have received intense training and are of another level in endurance and speed. Meanwhile, we see the 2 merchants in the carriage, laughing and imagining that Belle and Rango are repentant. However, they soon saw the Viscountess passing by them in a carriage, and they realize that the brothers are going to open a new commercial company. Finally, they arrive at the royal capital in the kingdom of Escuderia Panamera and head directly to the audience chamber in order to meet with King Dino and Zora Belrinete. After hearing what she has to say, the king admits that he assumed Panamera was there to request a higher title for herself. However, to his surprise, she clarifies that she wants the monarch to grant a title to someone else. Panamera confirms that the man in question is the lord of a remote village that is currently under her protection, which is why he cannot travel to the capital. The king questions why she would recommend someone like that to the nobility, and Panamera responds that this is due to the great exploits he has done, already accomplished, and, mainly, to the extraordinary potential he still possesses. This immediately arouses the king's interest, because considering Panamera's ability to judge, he believes that you can expect great feats from this young man. Still, you want to know what kind of achievements someone could have achieved in such a distant village, where soldiers or knights were not even sent. Without hesitation, Panamera reveals that he defeated a forest dragon, leaving everyone in the chamber completely astonished. The king asks if this gentleman is an elemental wizard, but Panamera clarifies that his magical aptitude is focused on production magic. Then he reveals that he is the son of Marquis Fertile Vane. Fertile, a boy of just 8 years old. Increasingly interested, the king listens while Panamera reports that, upon arriving at the village he was supposed to govern, Vane found it under attack by bandits. Even so, he defended it and eliminated the criminals with the help of his few subordinates and adventurers who accompanied him. After that, he used his production magic to build walls around the village, dig a moat, rebuild destroyed houses, and reinforce the defenses. The forest dragon attacked Panamera participated in the battle, but claims it only immobilized him. Vane and his men defeated him with their own strength, without suffering any casualties. Hard to believe, Panamera features a dragon fang. Dejected as evidence, plunging the room into absolute silence, she adds that the king should personally see how the village has changed under Van's rule in such a short time, ensuring that a man wise as he would realize that Van deserves to rule an even larger territory to strengthen the kingdom's defense. Convinced and intrigued, the king declares that he wants to meet Van as soon as possible. Upon leaving at the hearing, Panamera requests that it be publicly announced that Vanny Fertile killed a dragon and, in honor of this feat, was named Baron. Meanwhile, in the village, Van standardizes the houses, making them more elegant. He reconstructed the center of the village and even erected 2 towers, the Olio Tower and the Uva Tower, which symbolize the settlement and allow enemies to be detected from a distance, reinforcing even more defenses. With this, everyone can live in peace, and Van feels satisfied. Style notices his stomach growling and decides to prepare lunch, suggesting that they eat at the top of the tower. Soon, Van and his friends have a picnic at the top, enjoying the magnificent view of the entire village. Esparta comments that, with adequate buildings and facilities, perhaps it is time to officially call it Van City is reluctant, fearing that he will choose a ridiculous name like Van City, but everyone finds the idea charming. He ends the matter before the name catches on for good. After the meal, Tyler surprises everyone with a cake that he managed to prepare thanks to the ingredients acquired after Belle and Rango opened their shop in the village. Van is happy, feeling that all his effort has finally paid off and that the place is becoming really nice. Everyone enjoys the cake, except Tio, who has been eating sweets every day and has gained a little weight. At that moment, Kempson notices a group of people moving around, approaching. They don't look like soldiers or adventurers. When they go to check, they find people in precarious conditions. Asking if this is the village of Seattle, Esparta explains that, before the current foundation, there was a village with that name, which is why many still use it. An elderly member of the group reveals that they came from a neighboring village where they pay very high taxes and there are almost no young people to visit. To work, because the Condor took to reinforce his forces for the war, Van discovers that they belong to the county of Ferdinando, and, although theoretically he should not accept people from another domain, he realizes that they risked their lives to get there. He then decides to welcome them, offering housing, even if they cannot pay taxes for a while, since there is enough food, and he can build houses. The elderly man comes to wonders if that wouldn't be heaven, and informs that only 10 came first, but that the original village has around 300 people. Van asks if they would accept 1 house per family, which sounds like a dream. He sends adventurers to escort the rest and offers carriages to transport belongings. But the old man says they have 10 dairy cows thanks to the fertile pastures of the county. The news encourages Van, as they will be able to produce cheese, butter, and other derivatives, creating a new local industry. Thus, the adventurers set out to escort everyone to the village. Sarah and Ordo are surprised by Van's generosity, as he is welcoming 300 people and offering generous rewards for the mission. Florian warns them to be careful, remembering that they have already been surprised by a dragon before. When the new residents arrive, Van welcomes them with a great feast, offering grilled meat and rest in the prepared houses. Excited, some even cry with the quality of the food. Then, they ask if there will be work. Ivan asks them to help with the facilities in the stores and in the new cultivation fields, reassuring them about the finances, which will be under the responsibility of those who understand the subject. Ron states that, since Van's arrival, life has improved a lot, and everyone will do their best to ensure that the newcomers also prosper. Still fearful, they hear Van explain that, by moving, they are also helping the village, as soon there will be a commercial company, and development will continue. Little by little, they accept that they can have a better life there. Esparta remembers that, despite the growth, they are still far from becoming a city of 10,000 inhabitants, so development must continue. Bang! He notices a little icing on his sword mustache, but ignores it and reaffirms that he will work hard to transform the place into a real city. The next day, we see movement in the city and in the fields. Van comments that it's time to finish work, and Espada agrees, saying that now is the time to start studying Van. He complains, finding it absurd to have to study after working so hard, but Espada replies that he has never met anyone who died from studying. In other words, it's nothing that terrible Van, hearing this, thinks that he really doesn't have a heart. At that moment, Ordo arrives and Van asks why they have already returned from the hunt. Ordo explains that by accident, they ended up finding the entrance to a dungeon. Confused for a moment, until he remembered that that was exactly what they were trying to avoid, finding the dungeon. Then, Espada states that if the dungeon was discovered, it is mandatory to communicate immediately to the royal capital and send a messenger. Van realizes that there is no escape from this. With the discovery, many adventurers will gather in the village, and his father will inevitably learn about the development of the place. Orto and the other adventurers apologize for having found the dungeon, but Van says that since it happened, there is nothing to do about the situation. He decides to request that a communique be taken to the royal capital, assigning Zara to the task. Zara questions whether he will have to go alone, but Van remembers that he is the scout and was probably the one who found it. The dungeon, which he confirms, Ordo suggests that perhaps it would be better to go together, but Van interrupts, saying that Orto and the others should explore the surroundings of the dungeon, offering as a reward a large gold coin. Upon hearing this, Orto immediately changes his mind and tells Zara to be careful on the trip. Zara is discouraged at having to go to the capital alone, but then Van offers him a mithril dagger. He explains that he has already used all the mithril ore they had, making that weapon extremely valuable, and asks if it serves as payment. Zara accepts immediately and leaves to the royal capital. On the way, he thinks it will be a great job and admires the special dagger made by Van, believing that the trip will be peaceful. Suddenly, he sees a broken carriage surrounded by ogres. He reflects that they would normally be difficult opponents, but with the new dagger, they might even be disappointing. Advances against them and defeats the three with ease. Impressed, he comments to himself that that weapon is too good and that he might end up getting addicted to using it. Shortly after the battle, he hears the voice of a girl thanking him for saving her. She introduces herself as family and says that, based on the movements she saw, he must be someone very famous. Namesake responds that he is just a humble adventurer, but she insists that someone with that ability can only be renowned. Harai reveals that she is also going to the royal capital and thanks her again. Zara comments that she is heading towards the same destination and asks for her to get on the horse. She hesitates, saying she doesn't want to bother him, but he puts her on the horse and jokes that even the horse will be happier carrying her than him. During the journey, he asks why is she going to the capital family, explains that her father died in battle. He was a baron. After his death, the house was taken over. Now, she intends to try to get work in the capital. Perhaps as maid of some noble. Namesake says that she currently lives in a remote village and that if she wants, she can go with him. There will certainly be work, and in addition, he will be able to protect her. He guarantees that she will not get involved, will regret it. Family accepts the proposal and is grateful for the opportunity. Back in the village, Van reflects that, with the discovery of the dungeon, a lot of money will be needed to accommodate the large amount of adventurers to come. He plans to build a small city outside the original village. Espada asks if he is sure. Ivan confirms that he wants to create a new urban center aimed at adventurers. Espada agrees and suggests appointing a new municipal magistrate. Since Van will remain in the village and someone will need to manage the new city, Van accepts the idea and agrees to the appointment. Furthermore, Espada points out that it will be necessary to maintain security, proposing the creation of a separate order of knights for the new city. Van agrees. He decides that Dai and his knights will remain in city, while the new order will be called the Order of the Sword Knights. Sword asks if he is taking revenge by using that name, but the protagonist innocently replies that he is only 8 years old and does not understand none of these things. Outside, residents work pulling ropes and carrying materials, asking where they should put them. Van advises them to leave everything on the ground and thinks that, thanks to the collective effort, everything is going well. At this rate, they might be able to build the new city in about a month. At this point, Dai arrives, saying that they will get even more materials that same day, and everyone agrees excitedly. Van thinks that they can now form an order of knights with those men and calls Dai to talk, suggesting that they could invite them to join the Order of Knights of City. Dai responds that the idea is interesting, but there is a problem. Those men have already been recruited by the Order of Knights of Espada and even signed a membership contract. Van is shocked, but soon concludes that this is very typical of Espada, which already secured members even before the official creation of the Order of City. At that moment, Ganshim approaches and informs that Zara has returned, but has brought someone with him. Van is going to welcome him, and Zara confirms that he has already made the announcement in the royal capital. His side, Zara explains that he met her by chance. As she had nowhere to go, he decided to bring her to the village and asks if there is a problem with increasing the number of residents. Van replies that she is welcome, introduces himself as the lord of the territory, territory, and the girl introduces herself as Flameria. She says that she was attacked by orcs near the royal capital, and that Zara saved her. Van is surprised, but Zara minimizes it, saying that he only managed it thanks to the dagger that Van gave him Flameria. However, he insists that in her eyes he was wonderful, even more impressive than the heroes of Dee's fairy tales. Suddenly, Van sees a group running towards the village and asks if the end of the world has arrived. Chiral reassures him, explaining that they are adventurers attracted to the dungeon. After the announcement was made to the guild, several adventurers in search of easy fortune rushed there. Some of them warn that that area is dangerous, especially for such a beautiful girl who could become a target for perverts. Van realizes that despite their intimidating appearance, they are genuinely worried. Kachim agrees with this impression. Flameria comments that their faces are still a little scary, which leaves them discouraged. They apologize and reinforce the warning about the danger of magical beasts. Vanna thanks her for her concern and says that the village is right behind it. The adventurers are shocked to see such a huge wall and ask how it was built. Production in front of everyone, creating grids instantly. They stand with their mouths open, asking what kind of absurd magic that is. At that moment, Dai arrives bringing more wooden logs. Van thanks him, and the adventurers realize that this is the famous boy who is being talked about in the capital. Dai gets angry at being called a kid, pulls out his sword and says he will punish whoever called him that. One of the adventurers also takes out his sword and attacks him, but Dai cuts the weapon in half with a single blow. From that moment on, whenever he comes, they start to greet him respectfully, calling him boss and wishing him good afternoon. Still, many find it curious that the owner of a territory is just a child. When they ask why he ended up there, he simply responds who was expelled from home. Later, Orto and the other adventurers return from the dungeon and find the movement in the village strange, commenting that now there is a lot of competition. Van asks how it was exploration, and Orto confirms that they returned recently. When he sees Zara, he is happy, but soon notices Flameria and asks who Zara is. He introduces her, saying that he met her on the way to the capital, introduces everyone, and the group heads to the inn. Some adventurers whisper, asking if it's real, or if they're dreaming. Van comments that maybe he'll build a house for Zara, and Flameria Ordo immediately freaks out, asking if it's a house for both of them and starts hitting the floor in despair. Van then asks what the dungeon is like. Flameria explains that there are few monsters in the surrounding area, but the entrance is close to a deep cliff, making the place extremely dangerous. The trip there takes 2 to 3 hours, and the area is surrounded by hostile natural environments. Small base, they still haven't managed to build something suitable. She then insinuates that until now it wasn't possible, but now they have Van, who is capable of anything. Van comments that outside the forest it's very dangerous, but she responds that she will protect him. He thinks he can't back down, as he wants to develop the region and transform the place into something great. So, he starts making exaggerated requests, including a nap break and dessert after dinner, meals, even taking a corner and others to accompany him. To his surprise, Plural accepts everything immediately. He is shocked, as he thought he had made 2 absurd demands. Uriel agrees calmly, saying that they will leave the next day. They call Orto and tell him that Van will participate in the construction of the base in the dungeon. The next day, Van is escorted to the dungeon, although he does not believe that they would really take him. During the journey, Kanchim starts to feel sick. Ivan asks if he is okay. He replies that he is just sick and that he will soon get better. Suddenly, a giant log blocking the path draws attention, and some adventurers run to him. Ivan watches through the carriage window and sees that they can easily deal with the situation. As they leave the forest, Alt is impressed by the landscape, commenting on how clean and pleasant the air there is. Uncle sees a magical flying beast in the sky, and the two are amazed. Van thinks they are having fun, as if it were just an ordinary excursion. When they finally reach the crossing point to reach the dungeon, Van asks everyone to stop. As he gets out of the carriage, he sees an adventurer dancing on top of a huge trunk that serves as an improvised passage over a gorge. He is scared when he realizes that they were planning to cross the port and asks what happened. Ivan is shocked by the complete lack of sense of survival of the group. He explains that places like that need to be treated as extremely dangerous. The adventurers, confused, ask where exactly the danger is. Van tells everyone to get away, kneel down, and reflect on what they just did. When asked what the correct solution would be, an adventurer replies that they should cross more carefully. Van says that this is completely wrong. The right thing would be to build a robust and safe bridge. So, they build a suitable passage and cross without risk. Soon they see the entrance to the dungeon. Van asks what kind of bridge. of structure want him to build there, since space is limited. Some adventurers come up with absurd ideas, but Van refuses them all immediately. First, he installs a large door at the entrance of the dungeon to prevent monsters from escaping. Then, he decides to build a comfortable base of support for the adventurers, believing that when they arrive at a structured and safe place, they will face the dungeon with more confidence. In a short time, the base is ready, surprising everyone with its size. As they enter, Van explains the division. The first floor is a rest area and storage. The second houses the cafeteria, and the third is a restroom. Balcony. Everyone is enchanted by the view. Van explains that he thought of that space so they could relax, observing nature. Van still plans to install a water tank on the roof to collect water of rain and supply the bathrooms, warning that it should not be used as drinking water. The adventurers say they understood, but Van is sure they didn't understand anything, and leaves the management of the base in the hands of Ordo, asking him to take good care of everyone. When he realizes that it is getting dark, Van decides to return to the village immediately, because if he arrives after sunset, Espada will certainly be furious. Before they leave, Alt finds mithril ore in a corner of the dungeon. Ivan thanks him, recognizing the value of the find. When they finally arrive at the village, they see Espada standing in front of the gate with a scary smile. Van feels a shiver. Espada takes a step forward, says they need to talk, and asks Van to accompany him. Desperate, Van looks around looking for help. He calls Uncle, who offers to accompany him, but that's not exactly what he wants. He looks at Kanchim, who says it's impossible to interfere, and at Alter, who panics. Finally, he grabs Ordo by the arm and begs him explain the situation, since everything happened because they helped the adventurers. Even though Ordo is shaking, he finds courage and tells Espada that this time, the responsibility lies with the adventurers. Van gets emotional, believing that he will escape guilt. However, Espada tells Ordo to be quiet, puts his hand on Van's shoulder, and drags him into the village. The next day, we see Van and Alt walking around the village, and she comments that everything is very beautiful. Van thanks her and says that this was only possible thanks to the workers who worked hard to leave everything like that. Then he asks if she would like to live there, but he shows some insecurity, and then Van asks what she really wants, saying that she should just prioritize what feels it in her heart. Gathering courage, she responds that she wants to marry him, leaving Van completely surprised by the unexpected statement. Then embarrassed by what she just said, she asks, so he can pretend that none of this happened. Yet, Van walks away with a smile on his face, clearly happy to have heard those words. Soon after Belle and Rango return from the royal house, Alt asks if they managed to establish the commercial company, and Belle replies that everything worked out thanks to the van. Then they give him 130 platinum coins for the parts of the van dragon immediately, gives the money to Uncle, and asks her to take care of the amount. Uncle is completely shocked, as it is the first time he has seen so many platinum coins together. Kanchim asks about Panamera, and Rango explains that she needs to report to Count Ferdinand before returning to the village, since she has been saying that it is more fun to partner with Van than to belong to Count Van's faction. Upon hearing this, and begins to imagine that she might start living in the village, but Belle clarifies that Panamera intends to buy the territory next to the village. Rango then shows the Van an exquisite item that found in the royal capital when opening a suitcase. Van is surprised to see a rapid-fire mechanical bow capable of shooting up to 10 arrows per second. Van is overjoyed. Belle even comments in a tone of just kidding if he wasn't happier with the gun than with the 130 platinum coins. Ivan starts studying the equipment with a sparkle in his eyes and observes that it seems to be the happiest moment of his life. Using his production magic, he creates an identical replica. However, he realizes that the version he just made does not spin in the same way as the original from the capital Audi. She is surprised to see that even Van can make mistakes. Sometimes Van just laughs and says that she keeps failing, and that besides magic, he has nothing to brag about. Alt disagrees, stating that he has great talent. Both in swordsmanship and in studies, he responds that it is not talent, but the result of having been trained by a heartless butler and by a monstrous knight commander. Then asks what type of magical aptitude she has. The subject seems delicate and she is visibly shaken. Her uncle, he intervenes, saying that Van is not forcing him to answer, and that if he doesn't want to, he can remain silent after a moment. Alt reveals that his aptitude is for puppet magic. Van thinks that this type of magic, as well as its production magic, is considered useless among the nobility. He admits to never having seen anything like it, and asks her to show it really exciting. Alt ends up agreeing. Van creates a small doll with his production magic and asks if she can move it. He uses his magic, and the doll starts to move gracefully, and is delighted, saying that it is incredible magic and full of potential. Uncle asks if she can replicate the dance she did with the doll, and Alt confirms. Although he admits that he is better handling the doll than dancing in person, the uncle then suggests that he creates a doll the size of Alt so that it can put on a show for the residents of the village. Haute quality, however, he hesitates, saying that his magic is not something to be shown off to others. Van responds that if he thought that way, he would also hide his own production magic, which many consider useless. However, it was thanks to that magic that he managed to bring happiness to the entire village. He is sure that everyone will also appreciate her puppet magic. Convinced, Alt accepts a night small theater is set up in front of Van's house. The residents gather curiously, asking if what will happen there. Since he summoned them, Van thanks everyone for their presence and announces that from now on, from that moment, they will witness the magic of Alt amidst curious murmurs. People wonder what kind of magic will be presented. Audie starts to move the puppet, and some residents are shocked, believing for a moment that the doll is moving on its own. Others, however, soon realize that it is puppet magic and begin to comment among themselves, surprised at anyone who remembers stories ancient times in which people even turned their swords against members of royalty for fear of unknown powers. Moment Van raises his voice and asks everyone not to jump to conclusions. Just because the doll bowed, he declares that Alt's magic is just beginning from within. He questions whether about how the public will really react to what is coming when looking at her. He imagines that it must be even scarier for the Alt than for anyone else. Yet he encourages her with a smile, saying that everything is okay. He remembers the happy moments he lived next to Van. He remembers his words of encouragement and gathers courage. Taking a deep breath, he starts to execute the dance movements. At the same moment, the doll starts to move with lightness and elegance, following each gesture with impeccable precision. The residents watch open mouths. That is incredible, something that they have never seen before. The puppet seems to come to life before their eyes, dancing with grace and delicacy. Many murmur, impressed, saying that it is a magnificent performance, and they observe everything with admiration for him. That magic is truly extraordinary, as it has the power to give life to inanimate objects and transform them into something capable of moving people when it finishes its presentation. Everyone goes crazy, saying that her magic is incredible, and that the dance was really beautiful, or thinks it was so scary that she thought her magic was a bad skill. Van goes to her and congratulates her because she managed to grab him and starts crying with happiness the next day. Conchim goes to the van in despair, saying that a carriage with the coat of arms of the royal family is going in towards them. Van goes to the village door and sees Panamera standing there. She greets him and he says, "It's been a long time since he saw her." She thinks it's a very sad reaction. To those who haven't seen her in a long time and ask if he found another woman, he explains that he and Alt have become closer than before. Alt greets Panamera with a smile, and she is shocked, asking what trick he used, as it is a very big change to occur in such a short time. Van explains that Alt thought her magic was bad, and he just showed what an incredible talent he is. Panamera says to finish this conversation later and kneels down, telling Van to do the same as he is in front of the king. Everyone kneels down. The king gets out of the carriage and goes to Van and asks if he is Van Nefer and asks him to raise his head. He introduces himself as Dino, the king's squire, and the man next to him introduces himself as the prime minister. The king names him Baron and says that he is now part of the low nobility, asking him to work hard to bring benefits to the country. Van thanks him and states that he will do his best. The king comments that he heard that a dungeon was discovered in his territory and asks that he does not hide anything about this. To conclude, he mentions the defeat of the forest dragon, saying that it was a wonderful achievement. The minister comments that the place is unusual and that even the king himself was there to check. The king asks him to answer all the questions accurately. Ivan promises to only tell the truth. He says he will show everything, but if the king doesn't believe, it will be considered a lie. So he asks that the king also struggles to believe. The king promises, and everyone enters the village. Van presents the place as Vila City, shows the walls, the gate, and even the moat. Then presents the ballista at the top from the wall and asks the prime minister what he thinks. The minister says that the ballista is good for attacking opponents at a certain distance and of a certain size, but it is not easy to use. Vaughn says that will show how it works and asks Kanchim to aim at the forest. Chin fires the ballista, and the king is shocked by the power, and Range, the prime minister, is also surprised because it fires 2 projects at a time without depending on first-class archers or wizards. The minister also notes that the star-shaped barrier is strange. Van explains that this shape allows attacking enemies from several directions. Fadanita adds that it is a perfect defense, except against air attacks. Van says he has already done some. adjustments against this type of threat, but he hasn't tested it yet. The minister comments that the way he talks, it seems like he built everything himself. Van confirms that he was the one who did everything. The king says no will tolerate lies, and he swears that he is telling the truth. Panamera asks the king to understand his distrust, but to first listen to what Van has to say. The minister asks who built the walls, and Van responds again that it was he. Also asks who built the urban area as it is, a development project that would normally take years. Ivan says he made an effort to build everything. Then the minister asks how many years it took to build the walls. Ivan replies that it took about 4 months. The king asks if the minister managed to understand anything, and he says it is difficult to understand. Panamera suggests that perhaps it would be easier if the king saw Van doing it himself. Van agrees and asks everyone to go to the back. They go to the lake, and the king and the first minister are shocked to see the mythical species standing there in such a sloppy way. At that moment, Scene arrives and greets Van. Van asks the sword if they can build a bigger wall high at the bottom of the lake. Sword agrees and builds an earthen wall soon after. Van uses production magic to finish the wall. They tell the king and the minister that this is how they build things, then go to the houses on the lake inside. See this question, who are the other two? Ivan explains that it's like a big boss that brings together several other bosses. View says that this must be treated with the utmost respect because they respect those who lead the clan. He introduces himself to the king as the leader of the clan, Lada Vista Lada. The king introduces himself as Dino, the king of the kingdom, and says, being happy to meet him, the king offers him a gift as a symbol of friendship. Panamera is shocked to see that it is orichalcum, and the prime minister freaks out saying that it is a mystical metal too known as the metal of the gods. The king states that he did not expect to find something so valuable there. The minister comments that if they made a sword with that metal, it would easily cost more than 100 coins platinum, and the king says it doesn't make sense. Worry about this mere amount, as it would be a national treasure. At that moment, Van makes a sword without worrying about who is around, leaving the king and the minister shocked. He tries to hide the sword, but it's too late. The king asks if he can make swords. Van tries to hide it, but Panamera tells him to be honest. The king asks if there is anything Van wants. Van asks it to be his granted permanent residence in the village because no matter what happens, he doesn't want to go anywhere else. The king asks why, since he should go to the capital, and even promises treatment preference depending on his title. But Van says that if he moves away from there, who will protect his people because the people cannot be left without food, clothing, or shelter. And that is why he wants to create a territory where everyone can live their days in peace. The king agrees, despite dearly wanting the baron's skill, and asks, even though he is not going to the capital, if he can send some emissaries to that place, and if the baron will cooperate. Van responds positively, saying that he will be happy to help back to the center of the village. The king comments that he cannot stay away from the capital for long, and asks them to take a look in the dungeon. Ivan recommends that the dungeon is far away and the sun will soon set, so they should go the next day. At that moment, someone shouts that an emergency has arisen and that a dragon is attacking. The Vila Van tells everyone to prepare for defense and call. The adventurer's Panamera asks if he needs help, and he agrees. He asks where the dragon is, and when he looks up, he sees it hovering over the village. Sword says that there appears to be a wizard riding the wyvern giving instructions. The king asks the prime minister what he thinks of the situation, and the minister responds that wyverns normally act in groups, so it is extremely unlikely that just one is attacking the village. Observing the wizard better, he believes that there must be some other threat nearby. The king asks if that could be the work of Araneta, and the minister says that it is very likely. Van then questions whether Araneta's kingdom would be interested in that village. Meanwhile, Dino warns the baron that the enemy is not just the wyvern, that there is probably also a small group of knights involved. Asking him to be careful, Van realizes that at that time, ordinary arrows would not reach the target and decides to use a prototype that he had prepared. In the forest, we see a prince being informed that they will soon reach enemy territory and that the wyvern has already started reconnaissance in the sky. The prince is angry at having placed under his command an attack on such a remote village. One of the knights explains that, precisely because it is an important mission, it was entrusted to him. Another soldier comments that their kingdom has maintained a long period of hostility with the kingdom of Escudera, and the time has finally come to settle the score. When they arrive at the city, everyone is impressed by the huge walls and wonder how someone managed to build a fortress of that size in such a distant place. The prince, however, states that building a fortress like that is not simple, and concludes that that must just be a facade to intimidate enemies. He then orders the soldiers to advance against the city. The soldiers obey and, using a large log as a battering ram, try to bring down the main gate, but they can't even open a crack. From the top of the wall, Ivan introduces himself as the lord of the village and asks why they bothered to come from the kingdom of Araneta. Prince asks how he knew which kingdom they they were from. Ivan calmly responds that he just guessed, and he ended up confessing alone. Angry, the prince complains that that village shouldn't be a fortress and demands to know what trick they used to build it. Ivan simply responds that he and the residents built everything together. Enraged, the prince orders one of the guards to send the wyvern attack. The guard hesitates, saying that the wyvern can be defeated, but the prince insists, stating that it is practically a dragon and that there is no chance of them losing. Getting out of Van's face, he says that the village will be destroyed. At that moment, Van gives the order for Panamera to fire the ballista. The shot is fired, and the wyvern is defeated almost instantly. Then we see Van's prototype. Instead of an arrow common, he fired several shurikens through the ballista. As they are lighter, they can reach a much greater distance. The king and the minister are shocked by the power of that weapon and comment that its strength compares to the 4 great elemental magics. The prince is also surprised to realize that the king himself is observing the defense of such a remote village. Van asks his enemies if they intend to continue fighting, and the soldiers immediately surrender. The prince, furious, calls them cowards and orders them to protect his lord. Realizing that he has not given up yet, Van sends Panamera fire again. The projectile lands right in front of the prince, who is completely shocked. With no other choice, he also surrenders. Observing everything, the king comments to the minister that Marquis Fertil has a truly terrifying son. The minister responds that he heard that Baron Van had been expelled from home. The king then comments that the Marquis probably never imagined that someone with a ability considered inferior would be able to do something like this. Then, inside the territory, we see the prime minister asking the prince what the plan for his kingdom was. However, the prince says, "No, we'll tell nothing." At that moment, Panamera points the sword at him and asks if she can start cutting and begin the torture immediately. The prince decides to collaborate. He reveals that the kingdom of Araneta comes planning this invasion for years, and to begin with, they decided to attack the village that belongs to the Marquis family territory, as, being a remote village, it would be easy to take control. Prime Minister asks if they also intend to invade other territories, and the prince reveals that the main force is already attacking the capital. Panamera asks exactly where, and he responds, which is the fortress city Escudeto. The Viscountess and the minister are amazed by the information. She returns to the king and says that he told her everything. The prime minister states that they need to return to the capital immediately and organize the order of knights. The king agrees, but says there is something he would like to ask before. Then he turns to Baron Van and says that he needs his participation in the defense of Escudeto. Van responds that he feels honored by the invitation, but leaving the village, which is still in the process of development, would be practically abandon it. The prime minister comments that he has weapons capable of destroying dragons, armored lizards, and even wyverns. And yet he continues to say that the village is still in development, Ivan confirms, saying that he hasn't completed even a tenth of what he would like to do there. Panamera starts to laugh and says that he is infinitely curious to see all the other things incredible that he still intends to create, but states that it is better for him to accept the request, because, in times of national crisis, all nobles must cooperate. So, he agrees to participate, but asks permission to decide on the formation of his own troops, and the king accepts. He asks the sword to protect the village as acting lord, and the sword agrees. The sword asks if he will be okay without him, for nearby Van responds that, in fact, he would like the sword to go with him. However, he is the only one capable of taking care of the village in his absence. Then Van asks Dee and the other knights to help him, accompany him, and Dee accepts. He asks Tio and Kanchim to remain in the village, as the mission will be dangerous. However, the two respond that they will follow him anywhere. Van begins to wonder if those numbers are acceptable, as there are very few, and imagine what people in the capital will say when they find out Dee comments that there really are few. But anyone who knows Van's strength knows that he is more than capable. At that moment, a group of adventurers arrives and says they accept the escort job. Van is shocked by the proposal. The adventurer explains that normally they don't accept jobs that involve war, but as it is to escort Van, they will willingly go. Van then asks Orto to speak to the other adventurers as well, and offers a reward of a large gold coin and 5 silver per person, which leaves everyone shocked by the value. Orto thanks him and says that, with a reward like that, everyone will accept the job with pleasure. At that moment, Panamera tells Van that he will return to report to Count Ferdinandus. "Gather the troops and leave quickly to help." Squire Van replies that everything is fine and that they should meet their Panamera, then asks what he intends to do about the weapons. Van says he would like to take something, but he can't just carry the ballistae as they are too heavy. Alt then comments that he will take his doll. Outside, we see Van explaining to the knights that this is their first expedition and that the mission will be to defend Escudeto. He says that the enemy has a lot of experience in combat, unlike them. However, it makes it clear that we'll fight on the front line, as their objective is to return with everyone unharmed. Meanwhile, at the Marquise's mansion, he receives news that Escudeto has been taken. The butler informs that the troops of Iranita advance towards Lark. The Marquis responds that Escudeto would not fall so easily and states that he will organize a troop to march immediately. He orders the butler to send emissaries to the neighboring lords to request reinforcements. The butler comments that the nearby village of Escudeto is ruled by Luan. The Marquis responds that they cannot send soldiers as they probably barely have food to survive. However, the butler says he recently heard that Luan was given the title of Baron for his exploits in slaying a dragon. The Marquis refuses to believe this, stating that Luan does not have any of the 4 magical elements, and orders the butler to quickly carry out orders. Later, upon arriving at the south gate of Escudeto, the Marquis is completely shocked to see that the city's sturdy walls had given way. At that moment, he sees a troop of wyverns in the sky, and immediately orders everyone to retreat and reorganize. But before they can react, the troop of wyverns advance directly against them. They throw several bombs into the sky, and the Marquis is completely shocked by that new weapon. When he thinks that this will be the end of him, the wyverns suddenly change direction and fly to the other side of the territory, leaving the Marquis confused without understanding what happened. From the west, we see Alt's doll defeating several wyverns that approach. Even when more wyverns continue to arrive, Alt continues facing everyone without backing down. Ivan watches the scene impressed and says that it is incredible, because I had no idea that she was capable of doing something like that. One of the knights comments that he never imagined that Escudeto would be conquered so easily. Dick adds that Escudeto's knights they should be fighting back, but faced with an unknown weapon like that, the only realistic option for them was to retreat. Van then explains that they will continue fighting just to buy time, allowing the knights to escape to safety. At that moment, the knights from the enemy kingdom found the group and advanced to attack them. Kansim fired using his new weapon, while the enemy archers try to target Van. However, Zara quickly eliminates the archers before they can shoot. One of the wyverns flies directly towards Van, but the optics quickly cut in the air. Seeing this, one of the enemy knights orders the entire troop to advance against Van. Even so, Van believes he has already done enough, as he managed to buy time for everyone to escape. Orders the group to retreat. The adventurers ask if they will really flee, as they believe they can still win the battle. But Van remembers that he made it clear from the beginning that the objective of the mission was to return home without any deaths. In the capital, we see a knight asking the Marquis what the next step will be. The Marquis responds that they need to guarantee the retaking of Escudeto, and that to do this, they must immediately reorganize the orders of knights. At that moment, Murcia arrives and the Marquis complains that he took too long. Murcia apologizes, and shortly afterwards, the king appears telling the Marquis not to frighten the younger ones. The Marquis immediately kneels down and asks for forgiveness for his actions. The king asks how the situation is in Escudeto and orders the Marquis to stand up. As he stands get up, the Marquis explains that Escudeto has been taken. The Prime Minister is incredulous upon hearing that, and the Marquis explains that the knights were attacked by a new enemy weapon and were destroyed in moments. The Prime Minister then asks how he managed to get out of there alive. The Marquis responds that, for some reason, the wyverns suddenly stopped attacking and flew towards to the west gate. The king concludes that it was probably Baron Van's support force. The Marquis is shocked by the information, and the Prime Minister explains that he developed the border village, defeated a dragon, and received the title of nobleman at a very young age. The Marquis says he cannot believe this. As Van does not have the aptitude for any of the 4 elemental magics, the minister asks if he is insinuating that he is lying, and the Marquis immediately denies it. Murcia clasps his hands tightly, and the king asks if he is frustrated by his older brother Nu to have accomplished a feat before him. However, Murcia responds that, on the contrary, he is very happy for Van. In another place, we see Van reunited with his troops who ask what he intends to do. Now Van responds that he has already fulfilled his duties as a noble, but if they don't repel the enemies now, now, there will always be constant threats. Audi comments that it was the first time he had seen a war, and that he didn't want to go back to that place. Even so, Van explains that Panamera is his partner, and she will be participating in the war, so he needs to offer some kind of help. He concludes that it is time to develop a new weapon, a catapult that can be used on the battlefield to support the army. This will also prove that they have given enough help. So he creates one in front of everyone, and everyone is impressed by the size of the weapon. Van says he intends to create 25 of them, but transporting everything to Escudedo would be extremely difficult. Soon after, he finds a solution better. Instead of transporting the catapults, he can simply build them directly on the battlefield. And it is exactly at this moment that the episode comes to an end. Don't forget to comment on word Baron to prove that he reached the end of the video.